The wind howls relentlessly across the jagged, limestone coastline of Ithaca, where the rusted bronze of ancient armor still bleeds into the rocky, unforgiving soil. Here, over 3 millennia ago, survival demanded far more than brute physical strength. It required a ruthless, calculated deceit that would forge the dual legacy of a warlord revered for his lethal cunning and later despised for his absolute dishonor. The crashing, violent waves of the Aegean Sea battered the shallow hulls of narrow black ships, vessels carrying desperate men who carved out brutal empires with bloodied spear points and merciless trap setting. Tell us where you're watching from. What time is it for you? Settle in as we journey back to a violent, unforgiving era where glory was bought strictly with the blood of the unwary and the suffocating silence of the conquered. The Bronze Age was never a time of noble champions stepping forward for fair, formalized combat on pristine battlefields. It was a vicious era defined entirely by brutal economics, pirate raiding economies, and opportunistic slave capture. The harsh, rocky terrain of the Greek islands could not support massive agricultural empires, forcing local kings to look outward, across the treacherous waters, for survival. The Greeks elevated a concept known as metis, a highly specific brand of cunning, trap setting, and absolute deception, as the ultimate weapon of survival. Odysseus of Ithaca embodied this trait entirely, leveraging calculated lies, sudden ambushes, and broken oaths to secure power and vital resources for his barren, rock-strewn island kingdom. His authority did not rest on divine mandate or beloved rulership. It rested entirely on his physical ability to outmaneuver stronger, heavily armored opponents, strip them of their wealth, and sail away before lethal retribution could fall. To understand the king of Ithaca is to understand a warlord operating a ruthless protection racket masked as divine kingship. He utilized the vast, treacherous geography of the Mediterranean basin to strike vulnerable settlements without a single warning cry. He built his raiding fleet from the raw spoils of aggressive coastal attacks, stealing vast herds of livestock, bags of raw grain, and human cargo to fuel the primitive, demanding economy of his homeland. Men flocked to his banner not out of devotion or national pride, but because his lethal ingenuity promised vast, immediate plunder. To survive the Aegean meant mastering the unpredictable squalls, the jagged shoals, and the art of the sudden, devastating raid. A commander who could not provide spoils would quickly find his throat slit by his own starving crew. Therefore, Odysseus commanded his men through the sheer force of his own survivability, executing ruthless, bloody decisions that kept his crew fed and his holds filled with stolen silver and bronze ingots. They loaded their narrow ships with heavy figure-eight leather shields, coils of thick hemp rope, and sharpened bronze weapons, meticulously calculating their strikes against weakened, isolated coastal towns. The loading process was a masterclass in brutal efficiency, with men shoving heavy wooden rollers under the keels to drive the ships into the biting surf. The pungent, metallic smell of oxidized bronze and stale, unwashed sweat permeated the tightly packed ranks of warriors as they strapped on layers of hardened oxhide leather and heavy, beaten metal. These men fought for raw survival, seizing control through calculated violence, nighttime ambushes, and overwhelming aggression. Warfare in this harsh, salt-scoured environment demanded absolute pragmatism, stripping away any modern notions of fairness or mercy. A defeated settlement was not merely conquered, it was systematically dismantled. The men were slaughtered, the infrastructure burned to ash, and the women chained to the rowing benches to serve as human currency in the slave markets of the wider Mediterranean. Odysseus understood this brutal calculus of his world perfectly. The strong took what they needed by force, and the clever took from the strong by stealth. The sea served as an unforgiving highway for these maritime marauders, offering absolutely no refuge for the weak or the hesitant. The constant threat of piracy meant that every coastal settlement had to be heavily fortified, and every trading vessel had to double as a warship. The Ithacan king thrived in this chaotic theater of war, turning the treacherous currents and the blinding sun into his own personal weapons. He was a predator in a sea of predators, always watching the horizon for the next target, the next vulnerability, the next opportunity to exploit the unwary. The grating scrape of a heavy wooden keel against wet gravel echoes over the roar of the tide as the final provisions are loaded aboard the vessels. A black ship catches the heavy wind, its massive square sail billowing violently as the carved prow cuts eastward toward an inevitable, blood-soaked war. Agamemnon's massive coalition fleet slammed onto the wide beaches of the Troad, driving a massive wedge of hostile timber and heavily armed bronze into the coastline of Asia Minor. The Trojan War was an industrial-scale siege, driven entirely by the absolute necessity of controlling the highly lucrative trade routes that bottlenecked at the Hellespont. The Greek forces did not arrive to duel honorably in the dust for a stolen bride. They arrived to choke the life out of a thriving, wealthy metropolis, cutting off Troy's vital supply lines and violently dominating the surrounding agricultural plains. They constructed a sprawling, squalid encampment of sharpened wooden palisades, dragging their heavy galleys high onto the sand to serve as fortified barracks and defensive barricades against counterattacks. For 10 grueling years, the coastline became a festering wound of localized warfare, disease, and starvation. Men like Odysseus executed a systematic, relentless campaign of terror across the neighboring territories, leading violent night raids to burn ripe crops, slaughter defenseless farmers, and enslave the local women who were subsequently forced to serve as the grinding labor force for the Greek camp. Bronze Age warfare was a brutal, grinding mechanism of attrition that favored the ruthless over the brave. Armies did not engage in constant, pitched battles on open plains. They endured agonizingly long stretches of dysentery, malnutrition, and vicious tactical raiding. Chariots tore across the dusty plains of Ilium, functioning less like shock cavalry and more like mobile archery platforms and heavy transport for armored warlords to dominate the skirmish lines. These war machines kicked up massive clouds of blinding dust, allowing elite killers to strike the flanks of infantry formations before retreating behind their own heavy defensive perimeters. Commanders dictated troop movements to isolate Trojan allies, bribing neutral kings with stolen gold and assassinating enemy scouts in the dark to permanently blind the defenders of the city. The Greeks dug massive, muddy trenches, fortifying their coastal position against the sudden, devastating sorties launched by the heavily armored Trojan elite. War in this era was an absolute economy of violence, where the primary objective was the acquisition of raw materials, bronze ingots, and captive labor to send back across the sea. A brutal, direct frontal assault on the towering limestone walls of Troy proved strategically impossible, forcing the Greek coalition to rely entirely on protracted siege mechanics, starvation, and scorched earth tactics. Every olive grove was chopped down, every freshwater spring was contested, and every trade route was blockaded by swift-moving raiding galleys patrolling the straits. Survival within the sprawling Greek encampment required the very metis that Odysseus had perfected on the shores of Ithaca. He commanded raiding parties deep into the hostile interior, tracking local supply caravans and ambushing them with devastating volleys of arrows and thrusting spears. His men stripped the dead of their armor, their weapons, and their provisions, carrying the bloody spoils back to the ships to sustain the failing war effort. The brutality of the siege eroded any lingering illusions of martial honor, replacing the strict codes of aristocratic combat with the desperate, feral instinct to simply survive another week in the dirt. Disputes over plunder and captive women frequently threatened to tear the coalition apart, requiring ruthless political maneuvering and calculated threats of violence to maintain the fragile command structure of the massive invasion force. Odysseus operated as the grim enforcer of this fragile alliance, utilizing bribery, extortion, and sudden violence to keep the lesser kings in line and focused on the destruction of the great city. He understood that the massive walls of Ilium could not be battered down by bronze axes or ramming logs. The engineering of the era heavily favored the defenders, who rained rocks, boiling pitch, and heavy spears down upon anyone foolish enough to approach the gates. The siege required a level of psychological endurance that pushed men to the absolute breaking point, forcing them to watch their comrades die from infected wounds and sweeping plagues. The metallic scrape of a drawn sword against a heavy oxhide shield echoes through the shallow trench lines as the vanguard prepares for another grueling, bloody skirmish in the baking sun. A lone king surveys the impenetrable, towering stone fortifications of Ilium, his calloused grip tightening violently around the shaft of a heavy ash spear. 10 long, agonizing years of grinding, bloody stalemate systematically shattered the morale of the vast Greek coalition, forcing a critical, necessary shift from blunt brute force to catastrophic, civilization-ending deception. The towering defensive walls of Troy, engineered with massive, precisely interlocking blocks of dressed limestone, fundamentally defied every conventional siege tactic the Greek warlords deployed. Battering rams splintered uselessly against the heavily fortified bronze gates, and wooden scaling ladders were immediately repelled by highly organized defenders raining heavy stones and boiling pitch onto the desperate attackers below. The siege had definitively failed, threatening to send the coalition home in absolute disgrace and financial ruin. Odysseus of Ithaca orchestrated a radical shift in military strategy, recognizing with cold, ruthless pragmatism that the heavily fortified city could never be taken by a direct frontal assault. It could only fall from within, effectively dismantled by the hubris of its own inhabitants. He commanded the immediate construction of a massive wooden construct, ordering his men to cannibalize the seasoned timber from dismantled raiding galleys and to aggressively log the vast, ancient pine forests surrounding the slopes of Mount Ida. This towering wooden structure was not merely a monument. It was an unprecedented masterpiece of Bronze Age military engineering and psychological warfare, built entirely under the strict guise of a massive religious offering to the gods. Odysseus intended to weaponize the deep-seated, systemic religious beliefs of the Trojan defenders, manipulating their piety to secure the destruction of their empire. Laborers and specialized shipwrights worked under immense, unrelenting pressure in the brutal heat of the Mediterranean sun, cutting dense wood with heavy bronze saws, shaping massive planks with broad adzes, and fitting thick, crude iron rivets to form the cavernous, hollow belly of the towering horse. The mechanical logistics of the build required vast amounts of thick hemp rope, heavy wooden pulleys, and the brute strength of hundreds of enslaved laborers to assemble the towering framework on the blood-stained sands of the beach. The operation required total, unbreakable operational secrecy, enforced by the immediate threat of execution for any man who spoke of the plan outside the command tent. Odysseus personally selected the elite assault team that would physically seal themselves inside the dark, stifling chamber, choosing only hardened, battle-scarred veterans who possessed the iron discipline to endure extreme physical torment without making a single sound. To effectively sell the monumental lie of a defeated, broken withdrawal, the Greeks systematically set fire to their own sprawling encampment, deliberately destroying 10 years of vital infrastructure, wooden barracks, and defensive palisades. They loaded their remaining supplies, launched their black fleet into the surf, and rowed heavily just out of sight, dropping heavy stone anchors in the sheltered coves behind the rocky, neighboring island of Tenedos to wait for the signal in the dead of night. The ultimate success of this civilization-ending operation relied entirely on the sheer physical endurance of the heavily armed men hidden deep inside the timber structure. Stripped of their heavy armor to save space and reduce noise, they endured extreme, suffocating heat, agonizing dehydration, and the severe muscle cramps of being packed tightly together in total darkness for hours on end. They listened in agonizing silence as the Trojans foolishly breached their own defensive walls to drag the massive wooden idol directly into the heavily fortified heart of the city, and they held their breath in absolute terror as enemy spears were suspiciously thrust into the outer planks of the horse, missing their flesh by mere inches. This was the Greek concept of metis weaponized on a scale never before seen in the ancient world, a devastating, localized trap designed to entirely bypass impenetrable stone defenses through sheer audacity, psychological manipulation, and calculated deceit. The sharp, resinous stench of freshly cut pine, boiling pitch, and stale, frightened sweat filled the stifling air of the dark chamber as the men waited for the city to finally sleep. The hidden Greek fleet pulls silently away from the safe anchorage of Tenedos under the cover of a moonless night, moving slowly toward a completely unguarded coastline. The devastating trap snapped shut in the absolute dead of night, instantly transforming a drunken, exhausted celebration of survival into a merciless, industrial-scale slaughter. The elite assault team physically breached the hollow belly of the wooden horse, utilizing thick, knotted ropes to drop silently to the polished stone streets of a sleeping, heavily intoxicated city. Odysseus and his hardened men moved with ruthless, mechanical efficiency, systematically slitting the throats of the sparse, unarmored sentries before they could raise a single cry of alarm. They advanced rapidly toward the main defensive perimeter, cutting down anyone who stirred in the shadows, and threw open the massive, bronze-reinforced gates of Ilium, signaling the returning Greek army that had silently beached their narrow galleys under the cover of darkness. The heavily armed invading force poured into the breach like a catastrophic flood of sharpened bronze and violence, completely overwhelming the disorganized and utterly disoriented defenders. What immediately followed was not a formalized battle of honor, but a systematic, highly organized extermination and localized looting operation designed to permanently erase the city of Troy from the map. The Greek heavy infantry surged relentlessly through the narrow, winding alleyways, intentionally torching the dense wooden infrastructure of the sprawling residential districts to create widespread panic, blinding smoke, and absolute tactical confusion. They violently targeted the strategic command centers of the city, executing the Trojan royal family with calculated, cold-blooded brutality at their own sacred altars, actively ensuring that absolutely no legitimate male heirs survived to challenge their newfound control or seek future blood vengeance. Heavily armored men wielding broad bronze axes violently stripped the opulent palaces of massive gold reserves, silver plates, and the vital copper and tin ingots fundamentally required to sustain their own military forces back across the hostile Aegean Sea. The brutal economics of Bronze Age warfare strictly dictated that the total destruction of a rival power was deeply intertwined with massive financial acquisition. The Greek warlords ruthlessly enslaved thousands of surviving Trojan citizens, physically ripping women and children from the burning ruins and violently binding them with heavy leather straps for immediate transport back across the sea. These captives were destined to serve as the grinding labor force in the agricultural fields and massive stone palaces of Mycenaean, Sparta, and the rocky shores of Ithaca. The ancient, unwritten code of warfare offered absolutely no mercy or quarter to a fallen, breached city. Physical survival in this hostile geopolitical climate meant the total, uncompromising erasure of the enemy's logistical capacity to ever rebuild or retaliate. The vast plunder was meticulously gathered in the blood-soaked central squares, aggressively divided among the surviving kings. The raw, physical capital fundamentally needed to pay their surviving soldiers and secure their political power upon returning home to their restive kingdoms. Odysseus directed his specific contingents to aggressively secure the most easily transportable and valuable spoils, leveraging the absolute chaos of the sack to maximize his own personal wealth and ensure the absolute loyalty of his men for the long, treacherous voyage ahead. He did not fight for the honor of a stolen queen or the glory of open combat. He fought specifically to fill the deep hulls of his black ships with enough stolen wealth to cement his dynastic rule over his island for generations. The violent eradication of Ilium was the ultimate validation of his deceptive strategies, proving that cunning could slaughter tens of thousands. The air grew rapidly thick and suffocating with the sharp, overwhelming stench of burning timber, roasting human flesh, and the heavy, coppery tang of freshly spilled blood baking on the hot stones. Slick, dark blood pooled heavily across the beautifully polished marble floor of the royal sanctuary as an entire civilization died screaming in the suffocating dark. A thick, black column of smoke rises from the shattered, ruined gates of Ilium, drifting out over a dark sea completely choked with the stolen spoils of war. The total destruction of Troy yielded vast, unprecedented wealth, but securely transporting that massive plunder back across the unpredictable, treacherous Aegean Sea required a violently contested passage along highly hostile shores. The arduous journey of Odysseus began not as a noble, triumphant voyage home, but as an immediate continuation of his brutal pirate economy. His black fleet, riding dangerously low in the water under the massive weight of stolen Trojan gold and enslaved captives, possessed a critical logistical vulnerability. They carried almost no food. Bronze Age galleys were incredibly narrow, shallow draft vessels engineered specifically for speed and rapid beaching, leaving absolutely no cargo space for the massive provisions required to sustain hundreds of heavily armed men over a long voyage. Therefore, maritime commanders were forced to resupply their fleets through aggressive, opportunistic coastal raiding, effectively turning every return journey into a rolling campaign of terror. Odysseus immediately directed his fleet northward, striking the wealthy coastal city of Ismarus in the territory of the Sicanies, a fiercely independent Thracian tribe. The Greek raiding parties hit the beaches with practiced, mechanical efficiency, swarming over the stone defensive walls before the local militia could effectively organize. They systematically sacked the settlement, slaughtering the armed defenders in the narrow streets, and aggressively seizing fresh, vital stores of cattle, sheep, and vast quantities of heavy regional wine. This raid was standard operational procedure for an Aegean warlord, an absolute necessity to secure the raw protein and hydration required to keep rowers functioning at peak physical capacity. However, the critical breakdown occurred immediately after the city fell, when Odysseus failed to maintain rigid military discipline among his hardened, exhausted men. Recognizing the strategic danger of a protracted stay on hostile shores, the Ithacan king ordered an immediate tactical withdrawal, commanding his men to load the slaughtered livestock and launch the galleys back into the surf. The heavily armed crew, deeply intoxicated by their victory at Troy and the sudden influx of potent Thracian wine, outright refused the command. They prioritized immediate, gluttonous consumption over strategic safety, butchering the stolen cattle on the blood-stained sand and feasting around massive bonfires well into the night. This catastrophic breakdown in the chain of command, a constant, lethal threat in an army entirely motivated by plunder, provided the surviving Sicanies ample time to marshal overwhelming reinforcements from the rugged interior. At the first light of dawn, a massive Thracian counterattack slammed into the disorganized Greek encampment. The Sicanies deployed heavy, shock-action chariots across the flat expanse of the beach, cutting off the Greek retreat and raining devastating volleys of bronze-tipped spears into the chaotic, drunken ranks. The Greeks suffered horrific casualties in the initial barrage, their unarmored bodies crushed beneath the heavy, iron-rimmed wheels of the advancing war machines. Survival suddenly depended entirely on raw, desperate brute force as the surviving Greeks formed tight, defensive shield walls in the crashing surf, desperately fighting a rearguard action to protect the vulnerable ships. Heavily armed men were forced to wade waist-deep into the freezing water, utilizing massive wooden poles to desperately pry the heavy, loaded keels off the gravel beaches, while simultaneously dodging lethal spear thrusts from the shoreline. The violent, unforgiving reality of Bronze Age command required Odysseus to constantly balance the insatiable greed of his heavily armed crew against the absolute tactical necessity of staying mobile and unpredictable. 6 men from every single ship in the Ithacan fleet were slaughtered in the surf before the heavy square sails could be frantically deployed to catch the offshore breeze. The Greeks rowed with the desperate, tearing strength of men fleeing absolute annihilation, their muscles burning and their hands blistering against the heavy wooden oars. The harsh, intoxicating taste of stolen, unwatered wine mixed violently with the coarse grit of sand and the metallic tang of blood on the lips of the exhausted rowers. A sudden, violent squall rapidly darkens the northern sky, threatening to drive the heavy, overloaded wooden hulls straight back into the jagged, unforgiving rocks. The Mediterranean Sea acted as a merciless, indiscriminate equalizer, violently stripping the victorious warlord of his tactical advantages through catastrophic weather systems and deeply treacherous coastal geography. A brutal, prolonged northerly gale caught the Greek galleys as they attempted to round the notoriously dangerous headland of Cape Malea, ripping their heavy canvas sails to shreds and driving them far off the established, heavily navigated trade routes. Naval navigation in the Bronze Age relied almost entirely on line-of-sight coastal landmarks and the predictable movement of the stars. A fleet blown violently into the vast, open ocean was effectively blinded and stripped of all strategic control. The terrifying reality of deep-water survival in a shallow-draft galley immediately set in as massive, crashing swells threatened to swamp the open decks and drown the heavily laden vessels. The men manned the heavy wooden oars for 9 agonizing days on end, frantically bailing freezing salt water from the bilges and tearing the skin directly from their palms in a desperate, constant bid to fight the immense kinetic force of the towering waves. Odysseus commanded a fleet of men pushed to the absolute breaking point of physical collapse, their bodies heavily battered by the freezing winds and their discipline entirely eroded by the immediate, agonizing onset of severe starvation. When the battered fleet finally limped toward an unknown shoreline to seek fresh water, they encountered a terrifying breakdown of military cohesion far more dangerous than any armed ambush. They had drifted into the territory of the Lotus Eaters, an isolated, indigenous coastal population that utilized a highly potent local narcotic to effectively neutralize hostile threats. This was not a magical encounter, but a brutal lesson in the fragility of an army pushed beyond its physical and psychological limits. The scouting parties sent inland by Odysseus consumed the local flora and immediately suffered a catastrophic collapse of morale and unit cohesion. The narcotics stripped away their aggressive survival instincts, entirely erasing their desire to fight, raid, or endure the agonizing labor of the rowing benches. In an era where survival required constant, hypervigilant aggression, this chemically induced apathy was a lethal tactical vulnerability. To lose his vanguard to starvation or spears was an accepted risk of war, but to lose them to absolute indifference threatened to permanently anchor the entire fleet on a hostile shore. Odysseus responded to this unprecedented threat with immediate, overwhelming physical violence, completely abandoning any pretense of diplomatic negotiation. He marched a heavily armed contingent into the indigenous settlement, physically overpowered his own heavily intoxicated men, and dragged them violently back to the shoreline by their hair and armor. To ensure absolute compliance and prevent a mass desertion, he ordered the mutinous scouts to be brutally bound to the heavy wooden rowing benches with thick leather straps, forcing them to physically row through the sheer agony of their withdrawal. Command in the unknown territories required a terrifying, uncompromising ruthlessness, a willingness to inflict severe physical pain upon one's own forces to ensure the survival of the collective unit. The splintering, violent crash of massive ship timbers against hidden, submerged coastal reefs sent a shockwave of sheer terror through the exhausted, starving crew. The surviving wooden hulls scraped violently onto the coarse, jagged gravel of a completely unknown and desolate beach. Encounters on these deeply isolated, hostile shores demanded extreme tactical improvisation and brutal, uncompromising acts of violence simply to ensure the physical survival of the remaining crew. The Greek galleys pulled into a natural, deep-water harbor surrounded by heavily forested, mountainous terrain, entirely detached from the established diplomatic protocols of the Aegean basin. Desperate for fresh water and viable protein, Odysseus led a heavily armed vanguard inland, actively searching for indigenous settlements to raid or trade with. They advanced into a massive, naturally fortified limestone cavern, entirely unaware they were walking into a perfectly engineered kill zone controlled by a massive, fiercely territorial indigenous chieftain. Later mythologized by the Greeks as a monstrous, one-eyed giant, this adversary represented the very real, lethal threat of encountering overwhelming physical strength and deeply entrenched local power structures. The hostile herder did not view the heavily armed Greeks as protected guests under the sacred laws of hospitality. He immediately classified them as trespassing hostiles and aggressively neutralized the threat. He sealed the massive entrance of the cave with a colossal, immovable limestone boulder, instantly trapping the Ithacan warlord and his elite vanguard inside a dark, inescapable stone vault. The chieftain then systematically executed 2 of the heavily armored Greeks, violently shattering their skulls against the hard cave floor to immediately establish absolute physical dominance, consuming their rations and supplies. Stripped of his numerical advantage and entirely trapped by a massive stone barrier that his bronze weapons could not possibly dent, Odysseus was forced to rely completely on metis. Open, formalized combat was strategic suicide against a vastly superior physical force. Survival required calculated mutilation and a perfectly executed, localized ambush. Recognizing that killing the chieftain in his sleep would permanently seal them inside the tomb, the Ithacan king engineered a brutal, mechanical solution designed strictly to neutralize the threat and force the massive enemy to open the gate. He commanded his surviving men to secure a massive trunk of unseasoned olive wood, utilizing their heavy bronze swords to aggressively strip the bark and carve the heavy timber into a viciously sharp, heavy stake. They hardened the lethal point in the roaring coals of the cave fire, transforming a piece of raw agricultural debris into a devastating, armor-piercing weapon of desperation. Odysseus then initiated a calculated psychological attack, deploying the heavy, unwatered Thracian wine looted from Ismarus. He presented the highly potent, uncut alcohol to the massive chieftain, aggressively exploiting the enemy's lack of experience with the concentrated narcotic. The sheer volume of raw alcohol quickly incapacitated the indigenous warlord, driving him into a deep, heavily paralyzed stupor on the dirt floor. Working in absolute, terrified silence, the Greeks aligned the heavy, charred timber, coordinating their physical strength to maximize the kinetic impact of the strike. With a brutal, synchronized thrust, they drove the burning, hardened stake violently into the eye of the sleeping chieftain, executing a savage, highly tactical blinding designed to completely destroy the enemy's capacity to target them in the confined space. The immediate aftermath required a flawless, high-stakes extraction under the cover of absolute chaos. The blinded, agonizingly injured chieftain threw his massive weight against the entrance, rolling the heavy boulder aside to violently sweep the exit for escaping men. Odysseus secured his surviving forces by physically lashing them beneath the heavy, lanolin-soaked bellies of the chieftain's stolen, massive rams, utilizing the thick wool and the enemy's own valuable livestock as biological camouflage to bypass the heavily guarded choke point. His actions were driven strictly by the cold, logistical need to preserve his remaining combat forces and simultaneously secure the heavily guarded protein required to keep his fleet moving across the unforgiving sea. The theft of the massive flock was an absolute economic victory, a brutal transfer of vital resources from the conquered to the conqueror. The sickening, wet crunch of a charred, smoking wooden stake driven deep into living flesh violently echoed through the damp, blood-spattered confines of the cavern. Heavy, desperately pulled wooden oars violently break the churning surf, pulling the laden ships frantically toward the temporary safety of deep water. The catastrophic breakdown of absolute authority within the battered fleet proved far more deadly than any indigenous ambush, leading directly to violent mutinies and the senseless slaughter of heavily armed men. The harsh, unforgiving maritime environment and the constant, gnawing threat of starvation systematically eroded the established command structure, pitting an exhausted Odysseus against a desperate, highly suspicious crew of seasoned killers. Following a brief period of recovery on a fortified island, the fleet was presented with an unprecedented navigational advantage, a massive, heavily bound oxhide bag containing a localized manipulation of the prevailing winds, engineered to drive the galleys safely back to the rocky shores of Ithaca. Odysseus, trusting absolutely no one with the survival of his empire, maintained solitary control of the massive steering oar for 9 continuous days and nights, refusing to delegate command until physical exhaustion finally forced him into a deep, paralyzing sleep. In that critical moment of vulnerability, the discipline of the heavily armed crew instantly collapsed. Command in a Bronze Age pirate fleet relied entirely on the constant, visible provision of plunder. Secrecy inherently bred lethal suspicion. Convinced their commander was aggressively hoarding vast amounts of looted Trojan silver and heavy gold ingots within the sealed leather bag, the mutinous crew drew their sharpened bronze blades and violently slashed the heavy leather bindings. They did not unleash wealth. They unleashed a violent, localized atmospheric backlash, a devastating squall that immediately caught the heavy square sails and drove the entire fleet violently away from the visible coastline of their homeland. This catastrophic act of insubordination permanently doomed the vast majority of the invasion force, forcing them back into the hostile, uncharted sectors of the Mediterranean where they were systematically dismantled by highly organized, aggressive coastal tribes possessing superior naval artillery and fortified harbors. The ultimate collapse of military discipline reached its bloody apex when the starving, desperate remnants of the crew were violently stranded on a highly isolated island by unyielding, contrary winds. Driven entirely by the severe, agonizing cramps of absolute starvation, the heavily armed mob actively defied a direct, explicit edict from their commander and brutally butchered a sacred, fiercely guarded herd of local livestock. Odysseus, completely isolated and utterly unable to physically control the violent mob of his own men, watched helplessly as the total breakdown of martial law brought down total, uncompromising destruction upon the expedition. The men feasted aggressively on the stolen meat, prioritizing immediate, gluttonous survival over the strategic necessity of avoiding heavily fortified enemy resources. The environment, acting as a merciless enforcer of consequence, retaliated with a devastating maritime disaster the moment the heavily laden galleys finally attempted to launch back into the deep water. A sudden, hyperviolent storm cell slammed directly into the exposed fleet, generating massive kinetic swells that violently shattered the wooden hulls and snapped the heavy, old-growth timber masts like dry, brittle twigs. The catastrophic impact threw heavily armored men directly into the freezing, chaotic depths, their stolen bronze breastplates and heavy greaves instantly transforming into lethal anchors that dragged them straight to the bottom of the sea. Odysseus clung desperately to a shattered, violently tossing section of the ship's keel, entirely stripped of his men, his stolen wealth, and his royal authority. The heavy, greasy smell of roasting meat completely masked the sharp, metallic tang of sea salt on the fateful beach. A blinding crack of lightning violently splinters the heavy mainmast into a showering blast of burning timber, plunging screaming men into the black, suffocating depths. Stripped entirely of his raiding fleet, his heavily armed crew, and his vast looted wealth, the Ithacan warlord was violently reduced to a solitary survivor fighting a desperate, agonizing war of attrition against the ocean itself. Odysseus clung desperately to the shattered, splintered wreckage of his command ship, enduring blistering, inescapable ultraviolet radiation during the day and severe, muscle-locking hypothermia during the freezing nights as the treacherous, unpredictable currents dragged him across the unforgiving Mediterranean basin. Survival now depended entirely on raw, unyielding physical endurance and the grim, mechanical refusal to drown in the deep water. Utilizing the absolute limits of his physical strength, he constructed crude, improvised rafts from the salvaged, floating timber of his ruined fleet, tightly lashing the heavy planks together with frayed hemp ropes and strips of torn leather in a desperate bid to maintain crucial buoyancy. When subsequent, hyperviolent storm cells finally shattered these makeshift vessels, he was violently forced to swim directly through pounding, kinetic surf and jagged, submerged coastal reefs. His body was repeatedly battered by the immense, crushing force of the crashing waves, completely tearing the skin from his chest and knees as he navigated the lethal shoals. He eventually washed ashore in the wealthy, highly fortified territory of the Phaeacians, completely stripped of his royal authority, his bronze armor, and his lethal weapons, possessing absolutely nothing but the thick, saltwater bleached scars on his skin and the ruthless, calculating cunning in his mind. The physical degradation of his body was absolute. He was heavily emaciated, caked in dried salt, and bleeding from dozens of severe lacerations inflicted by the coral reefs. To secure immediate passage back to his island kingdom, he had to aggressively navigate the highly complex, dangerous diplomatic protocols of a cautious, wealthy foreign court. He could not rely on his fearsome reputation as a heavily armed warlord, because he presented as a starving, broken vagrant completely lacking the physical markers of Bronze Age elite status. Instead, He leveraged his deep tactical knowledge of aristocratic hospitality, executing a calculated, highly manipulative approach toward the ruling family. He carefully observed the local power dynamics, identifying the strategic influence of the queen, and immediately positioned himself as a humble, heavily traumatized supplicant to secure immediate physical protection under the sacred laws of the gods. He negotiated his extraction not with stolen Trojan gold or heavy bronze ingots, which he no longer possessed, but with the sheer, undeniable force of his strategic mind and his carefully doled-out accounts of unparalleled violence at the gates of Ilium. He effectively traded heavily sanitized military intelligence and diplomatic prestige for a fully crewed, shallow-draft galley designed to transport him silently back to the Ionian Sea. This was the ultimate execution of survival logistics, manipulating a foreign power into funding his return voyage without surrendering a single strategic asset of his own. Coarse, jagged sand gritted aggressively against brine-scoured, bleeding skin as the exhausted, starving survivor dragged himself violently from the crashing surf. A battered, naked man pulls himself slowly into the dense, protective cover of a wild olive grove. Odysseus finally returned to the rocky shores of Ithaca not as a triumphant, conquering warlord commanding a massive fleet, but as an invisible ghost actively infiltrating a kingdom poised on the absolute brink of total economic and political collapse. A massive, heavily armed coalition of arrogant aristocrats from neighboring islands had violently occupied his royal palace, systematically consuming his vast herds of livestock, aggressively harassing his wife, and intentionally draining the stored, generational wealth of his estate. To physically reclaim his throne against overwhelming numerical superiority, Odysseus deployed the absolute pinnacle of metis, intentionally disguising himself as a filthy, broken, aging beggar to conduct aggressive, highly dangerous reconnaissance directly within the heavily guarded walls of his own compound. He deliberately endured severe physical abuse, taking heavy, bruising blows from the arrogant usurpers to actively gauge their physical strength, count their exact numbers, and definitively identify the loyalists still hidden among the treacherous household staff. This was not a passive endurance of humiliation. It was a highly calculated, ruthless insurgency, a methodical gathering of critical military intelligence before launching a catastrophic, inescapable first strike. He moved silently through the smoky, crowded Megaron, actively mapping the architectural layout of the room, locating the heavy bronze braziers, the wooden support columns, and the exact positioning of the main exits. He secured the absolute, unquestioning loyalty of his surviving son and a highly select group of heavily armed herdsmen, meticulously positioning them to violently control the strategic choke points of the palace architecture. Operating under the strict cover of darkness and deceit, he explicitly ordered the immediate removal of all heavy shields, thrusting spears, and bronze swords from the walls of the Great Hall. He stripped the suitors of their vital defenses under the highly plausible logistical lie of protecting the polished bronze weapons from the corrosive, damaging smoke of the indoor hearths. In reality, he was mechanically engineering a flawless locked room massacre, deliberately transforming the opulent, loudly echoing dining hall into a sealed, inescapable slaughterhouse. The usurpers continued to feast heavily on his stolen cattle and drink his stored wine, completely oblivious to the lethal, highly organized military trap rapidly closing around them. They viewed the disguised king as a pathetic, broken amusement, entirely failing to recognize the calculating, predatory gaze of a seasoned killer actively measuring the exact distance between his position and their exposed throats. The foul, highly sour stench of spilled wine, roasting meat, and stale, unwashed bodies hung heavy in the stifling air of the Megaron. A heavily scarred, powerful hand tightens deliberately around the worn, polished wood of a beggar's staff. The violent reclamation of absolute power hinged entirely on a single, brutally decisive display of sheer physical dominance and superior Bronze Age engineering. The arrogant suitors arrogantly attempted to string the massive, deeply curved composite bow of the king, a highly specialized, lethal weapon constructed of precisely layered animal horn, flexible wood, and hardened animal sinew. This specific weapon required immense, explosive kinetic force and flawless physical technique to bend, completely defying the desperate attempts of the usurping aristocrats. They failed repeatedly, their soft, uncalloused hands and severe lack of mechanical leverage blatantly exposing their deep physical inadequacy for the harsh realities of Bronze Age kingship and warfare. Odysseus, finally shedding the filthy, restrictive rags of his elaborate disguise, stepped forward and took the heavy weapon into his own calloused hands. He meticulously examined the polished wood for dangerous rot or hairline fractures, checked the structural integrity of the horn, and effortlessly strung the massive bow, violently testing the extreme tension of the heavy gut string with a sharp, resonant pluck. He did not issue a loud, dramatic warning, nor did he offer a formalized declaration of war. He simply aligned his physical stance, locked his shoulder, and drove a heavy, bronze-tipped arrow with terrifying velocity straight through the exposed throat of Antinous, the lead suitor. The heavy bronze point violently shattered the cervical spine of the aristocrat, instantly dropping him in a massive, pooling spray of arterial blood. Absolute, screaming chaos instantly erupted across the great hall as the trapped, panic-stricken men suddenly realized the heavy weapons had been systematically stripped from the stone walls and the massive, thick wooden doors securely barred from the outside. Odysseus, immediately flanked by his heavily armed son and loyal herdsmen, rapidly established a highly secure, elevated firing line at the main threshold, utilizing the architectural advantage to rain continuous, devastating fire down upon the frantically surging mob. The heavy arrows struck with lethal, armor-piercing velocity, violently pinning screaming men directly to the thick wooden tables and shattering skulls as they desperately attempted to rush the exit. The king moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a veteran siege commander, methodically targeting the largest threats first and systematically breaking the physical mass of the charging enemy. The sharp, violent twang of a rigidly taut bowstring sliced continuously through the stunned, bloody silence of the great hall. The heavy, thick, bronze-reinforced doors of the Megaron slam aggressively shut, permanently locking the usurpers in a dark tomb of their own making. The resulting massacre in the Great Hall was not a chaotic brawl. It was a highly methodical, thoroughly ruthless extermination of the political opposition designed to permanently secure the Ithacan dynasty. Odysseus fired heavy, armor-piercing arrow after arrow directly into the desperate, surging crowd, the hardened bronze points violently shattering ribs, piercing lungs, and tearing completely through vital organs. When the quivers were finally completely emptied of ammunition, he and his loyal men rapidly donned heavy, polished bronze cuirasses and thick leather greaves. They took up long, broad-bladed thrusting spears and advanced aggressively into the frantic, bleeding survivors, thrusting and hacking with terrifying, mechanical efficiency. This was absolutely not a battle of honor or fair combat. It was a highly localized, deeply necessary political purge, explicitly designed to entirely eradicate the aristocratic bloodlines that had actively threatened his dynastic control and economic stability. The desperate suitors frantically armed themselves with whatever heavy wooden furniture, shattered pottery, or small, ineffective carving blades they could scavenge from the ruined feast, but they were entirely trapped, completely unarmored, and vastly outmatched by hardened, heavily armored veterans of the Trojan War. The Greeks advanced in a tight, disciplined formation, using their heavy shields to violently crush the usurpers against the stone walls before driving their bronze spearheads deep into their abdomens. Following the absolute slaughter of the aristocrats, Odysseus exacted immediate, merciless martial justice on the disloyal household staff, explicitly ordering the brutal execution of the female servants who had actively consorted with the enemy forces and betrayed the security of the palace. They were dragged violently into the courtyard and hung by their necks in a brutal, synchronized line using heavy ship's rigging, their feet kicking violently in the dirt, a highly visible, visceral warning to absolutely anyone who would ever challenge the absolute, lethal authority of the returning king. He then immediately commanded the heavily blood-stained halls to be aggressively scrubbed with burning sulfur and boiling water, utilizing the harsh chemical smoke to physically and ritually burn away the deep, putrid taint of the dead usurpers from his sovereign domain. The palace was systematically transformed from a site of chaotic rebellion into a heavily fortified stronghold, secured strictly through overwhelming bloodshed and the absolute destruction of his enemies. Hot, thick, dark blood pooled heavily over the crushed, lavish remnants of the violently interrupted feast. A heavily scarred king stands breathing heavily amidst the absolute butchery, his undisputed, total authority firmly cemented in splintered bone and brutally torn flesh. The localized slaughter of the island's entire aristocratic generation immediately triggered a massive, violent geopolitical backlash from the powerful, surviving families of the dead men, threatening to rapidly plunge the rocky kingdom of Ithaca into a devastating, prolonged civil war. In the brutal, uncompromising reality of the Bronze Age Aegean, a returning warlord could not simply execute over 100 noblemen without facing the absolute, unwritten mandate of the blood feud. The outraged fathers, heavily armed brothers, and vast retinues of retainers of the slain suitors rapidly mobilized, driven by the strict cultural necessity of violent retribution and the urgent need to physically secure their highly vulnerable landholdings. Odysseus, possessing the cold, calculating tactical awareness of a veteran field commander, absolutely did not wait for the disorganized rebellion to fully marshal their numerical superiority within the narrow, highly vulnerable confines of the port city. He immediately stripped his ruined, blood-soaked dining hall of any usable weapons, rapidly armed his surviving loyalists, and strategically marched out of the urban center to secure a highly defensible, elevated position in the rugged, rural highlands surrounding his father's sprawling agricultural estate. He fundamentally understood that permanently securing his reclaimed throne required one final, highly decisive clash of arms in the open field to permanently break the martial spirit of the insurgency. The enraged families of the suitors, rapidly abandoning any pretense of diplomatic negotiation, marched aggressively out into the rocky, sun-baked fields to directly confront the warlord. They formed a numerically superior but highly disorganized local militia, entirely lacking the rigid, mechanical discipline and lethal tactical coordination forged during a decade of grinding, attritional siege warfare on the bloody shores of Ilium. Odysseus violently arrayed his small, elite vanguard along a narrow, rocky choke point, aggressively utilizing the steep, highly irregular terrain to effectively neutralize the enemy's massive numerical advantage. He meticulously donned his deeply scarred, heavy bronze cuirass, violently tightening the thick leather straps over his exhausted shoulders, and secured a terrifying, highly specialized boar-tusk helmet to his head. He strictly ordered his men to lock their heavy, oxhide figure-eight shields closely together, rapidly forming an impenetrable, bronze-faced defensive wall that completely blocked the only viable path of uphill advance. When the vanguard forces finally collided violently in a chaotic, blindingly dusty skirmish, the sheer, undeniable disparity in military experience became immediately, lethally apparent. Heavy, broad-bladed bronze spears were violently thrown with massive kinetic force, and the deafening, metallic clash of heavy bronze weapons violently striking hardened leather shields echoed sharply across the desolate, rocky island. The Ithacan king, fighting shoulder to shoulder with his heavily armed son, systematically drove the heavy bronze points of their thrusting spears directly through the unarmored torsos of the rebel leaders, instantly decapitating the fragile command structure of the uprising in a matter of brutal seconds. The violence was executed with terrifying, mechanical precision, designed not to conquer territory, but to inflict such immediate, horrific localized casualties that the surviving rebels would instantly break formation and frantically flee. However, the total annihilation of the Ithacan populace was strategically and economically counterproductive. A Bronze Age warlord cannot extract vital wealth, military levies, or agricultural labor from a kingdom composed entirely of corpses. The sudden, extreme violence was abruptly halted by a highly strategic, enforced pact, a cold, hard political peace dictated entirely at the sharp point of a bloody spear. Odysseus aggressively leveraged the immediate, highly credible threat of mutual, total annihilation to physically force the surviving aristocratic families into absolute, unquestioning submission. He actively cemented his dynastic rule not through the beloved adoration of his people or the implementation of fair, equitable governance, but through the overwhelming, undeniable demonstration of lethal military force and absolute tactical superiority. He rapidly established a brutal, martial autocracy over a heavily fractured, deeply traumatized society, ruling strictly by the razor edge of a bronze sword and the deeply enduring, psychological fear of his ruthless, unpredictable cunning. The economy of the entire island was violently restructured to explicitly serve the crown, with the vast estates of the dead suitors aggressively absorbed directly into the royal treasury. The rhythmic, metallic clatter of heavy bronze greaves marching in disciplined unison down a hard-packed, sun-baked dirt path definitively signaled the unchallenged advance of the king. A tense, heavily armed peace settles permanently over the rocky, deeply blood-stained island of Ithaca. Centuries after the violent collapse of the Bronze Age palace economies, a massive, highly militarized empire rose in the West that sought to entirely rewrite the geopolitical legacy of the Mediterranean, actively rejecting the Greek glorification of deceit and trap-setting. The Romans, aggressively engineering a massive, state-sponsored cultural propaganda campaign, deliberately traced their imperial lineage directly back to Aeneas, a high-ranking Trojan prince who violently fled the burning, heavily looted ruins of Ilium. In the strictly controlled Roman narrative, the city of Troy was absolutely not a defeated, rightfully conquered enemy. It was the sacred, martyred mother city of their sprawling, highly organized military empire. Aeneas fought his way through the chaotic, blood-soaked streets of the falling city, physically secured his surviving people, and carried the heavy, sacred statues of his ancestral gods directly through the suffocating smoke of the Greek fires. He launched a desperate fleet and sailed aggressively west across the highly contested Mediterranean, surviving brutal weather systems and hostile coastal strikes to drive the foundational, iron stakes of a new civilization into the fertile, highly strategic soil of the Italian peninsula. Rome aggressively built its core national identity upon the rigid, uncompromising concepts of heavy infantry formations, highly disciplined open-field combat, and extremely strict, unbreakable codes of martial honor. They explicitly viewed the Greek reliance on metis, the calculated use of sudden ambushes, broken oaths, and nighttime trickery, as the ultimate, unforgivable markers of sheer cowardice and absolute moral bankruptcy. For a Roman commander heavily invested in the rigid mechanics of the manipular legion, a battle was a formalized, highly structural test of sheer physical courage and logistical superiority, entirely devoid of hidden traps or deceptive wooden idols. Consequently, the legendary wooden horse was completely stripped of its status as a stroke of tactical genius. The Romans actively remembered it as an unforgivable, cowardly war crime, a highly dishonorable, localized slaughter of heavily intoxicated, sleeping men. They explicitly taught their heavily armored legionaries to despise the very survival tactics that had kept the Ithacan warlord alive, demanding face-to-face, brutal engagements in the open dirt. The Romans built massive, heavily engineered road networks and towering stone aqueducts to physically manifest their absolute dominance, completely rejecting the chaotic, unpredictable maritime raiding culture of the ancient Greeks. Their immense geopolitical power was derived directly from the absolute stability of cut stone and forged iron, not the shifting, treacherous winds of the Aegean. The Roman state actively punished any of its own soldiers who relied on the highly deceptive, guerrilla hit-and-run tactics that had entirely defined the highly mobile, pirate economies of the ancient warlords. The empire required absolute, unquestioning obedience and uniform, mechanical bravery from its citizens to physically maintain control over its vast, sprawling borders. There was absolutely no strategic room for an unpredictable, highly cunning trickster king within the rigid, unyielding ranks of the Roman war machine. To elevate a man who survived purely by lying, adopting elaborate disguises, and aggressively fleeing superior forces was to fundamentally undermine the core military philosophy that allowed Rome to systematically conquer the known world. Therefore, the historical memory of the Trojan War underwent a massive, highly aggressive political revision, systematically shifting the moral high ground from the victorious Greek invaders directly to the slaughtered Trojan defenders. This monumental shift in cultural perspective was not an accident. It was a highly calculated, deliberate weaponization of history explicitly designed to spiritually unify a rapidly expanding empire under a single, highly militarized origin story. By actively claiming descent from the victims of the greatest deception in the ancient world, the Romans legally and morally justified their own aggressive, unrelenting conquest of the Greek city-states centuries later. They marched their heavy iron legions eastward across the sea, violently conquering the descendants of Agamemnon and Odysseus, effectively executing a massive, generational blood vengeance for the burning of their mythical homeland. The ancient, highly fluid myths of the pirate kings were violently crushed beneath the highly organized, standardized decrees of imperial expansion. The gritty, choking gray ash of a burning, heavily looted homeland clung tightly to the heavy, sweat-stained wool cloak of the fleeing Trojan refugee. A new, relentlessly aggressive empire physically drives its heavy iron stakes deep into the fertile, highly contested earth of the Italian peninsula. To completely legitimize their imperial destiny and permanently pacify their conquered territories, the Romans executed a highly systematic, utterly ruthless character assassination of the greatest Greek hero, permanently transforming Odysseus into a deeply reviled, treacherous villain formerly known as Ulysses. The Roman state apparatus aggressively weaponized the ancient, oral myths, heavily sponsoring elite poets, historians, and playwrights to carve an entirely new, highly regulated narrative. In this state-mandated version of history, the Ithacan king was completely stripped of his formidable survival skills. He was violently recast as a treacherous, pathological liar who relied exclusively on highly toxic poisons, cowardly political assassinations, and absolute deceit strictly because he utterly lacked the sheer physical courage to face true, heavily armored Trojan steel in the open field. He was no longer the brilliant, highly adaptable tactician who ended a 10-year siege. He was a highly manipulative, self-serving sociopath who actively betrayed his own allies to secure highly disproportionate shares of the looted silver and gold. Roman sculptors, operating under strict, highly lucrative imperial commissions, deliberately celebrated the stoic, heavily armored, broad-shouldered legionary, rapidly filling the sprawling public forums with towering, idealized marble statues of men who stood rigidly firm in the face of overwhelming violence. Conversely, their highly circulated state literature actively painted Ulysses as a desperate, scavenging coastal pirate, a deeply dishonorable man who routinely broke sacred oaths, actively manipulated his heavily armed crew, and mercilessly slaughtered the defenseless in their sleep. This aggressive, highly coordinated cultural rebranding was a vital, deeply necessary psychological tool for an empire that strictly required total, unquestioning obedience and highly disciplined, mechanical warfare from its vast citizen body. The deeply ingrained Greek concept of metis was actively classified as a severe threat to state security. A soldier who thinks exclusively for his own personal survival and openly deceives his commanding officers is a soldier who will instantly break the shield wall when the barbarian tribes violently charge the lines. The Roman propaganda machine successfully and completely inverted the established morality of the ancient world. They effectively criminalized the very concept of asymmetric warfare, demanding that all enemies of the state physically meet them on a flat, highly structured battlefield where Roman logistical superiority could violently crush any organized opposition. The cultural transformation of the warlord was absolute. The man who had outsmarted overwhelming indigenous forces, survived catastrophic, fleet-destroying shipwrecks, and single-handedly slaughtered an entire generation of usurping aristocrats was deliberately reduced to a mere cautionary tale. The historical legacy of the Ithacan king was completely, permanently fractured by this massive, geopolitical collision of sprawling empires. He remained highly celebrated by the subjugated Greeks as the ultimate, highly pragmatic survivor of a deeply unforgiving age, a man who utilized his brilliant, calculating mind to physically overcome impossible, highly lethal odds on land and sea. However, he was aggressively and permanently condemned by the ruling Romans as the grand architect of their ancestors' absolute darkest hour, a man entirely devoid of the sacred martial honor that forged the boundaries of the known world. His brutal, highly effective survival tactics, which once represented the absolute pinnacle of Bronze Age martial virtue and aggressive pirate economics, were deliberately and systematically buried beneath the crushing, inescapable weight of highly organized Roman imperial propaganda. The Romans actively replaced the unpredictable, highly fluid narratives of maritime survival with the rigid, highly codified laws of imperial dominance, permanently erasing the chaotic, blood-soaked glory of the ancient raiders. The transition from the bronze spears of the Aegean warlords to the heavy iron gladius of the Roman legions fundamentally changed how humanity waged war and how it remembered its most lethal killers. The steady, sharp, highly rhythmic chip of a heavy iron chisel shaping the cold, unyielding marble features of a new, strictly honorable imperial hero echoed loudly through the sprawling, sunlit forum. The lingering, highly dangerous shadow of a cunning, blood-soaked trickster slowly fades completely beneath the rhythmic, unstoppable, earth-shaking march of heavily armored Roman legions.